By way of further introduction, I wanted to talk about some of the experiences that I've had in those various public offices that, as were outlined, mostly because I think the most important part of this panel discussion today, although the panel is pretty sparse with just the two of us here, is the question and answer period. So I thought maybe in my introduction I could stimulate some ideas that maybe we can generate some questions and answers on. Before I do that, though, let me tell you how honored I am to participate in this panel as far as being at the Lou Frey Institute. Lou Frey is a friend of mine. In fact, I can tell you that when I was a UCF student, a charter classman, go Knights, I was working in Lou Frey's congressional campaigns, and then 6 short years after I graduated from here in political science and communication, Lou ran for statewide office the year that I was elected to the Florida legislature, so I'm honored to be here in that regard. When I was a member of the legislature from 1978 till 1992 in both the House and Senate, this blurring of the line between church and state I don't think was quite as obvious as it is today, nor was it a major issue that we had to deal with. There were a lot of religious arguments put forth on issues like abortion, issues like the Equal Rights Amendment, issues like sexual preference, but the issue itself of the appropriate wall between church and state really wasn't so much of a major issue. We had kind of passed the time of the great debate about the 62 ruling on prayer in school, and we went along in that regard. And of course that's very appropriate and acceptable that one would, as they were lobbying and trying to make a case for one side or the other, to invoke their religious beliefs. Today in the Florida legislature, and unfortunately Senator Webster is not here because he has much more knowledge about this. I'm neither an attorney or a constitutional expert, but that type of debate I think really has been accentuated in more recent time with Governor Bush's A-plus plan, which has to do with tuition vouchers, and later followed by his brother, the president, on his No Child Left Behind initiative at the federal level. So I think those kind of debates probably are more high profile today than they were when I was there. But I did want to talk a little bit also about the other jobs that I've had. You would think as Orange County property appraiser, the main job there, most people think, is to establish a taxable value of property. But there's a second important part of that job which has to do with the implementation of various laws relative to exemptions. And one of those exemption categories under the Florida Constitution has to do with a religious status of a piece of property. So we spent a lot of time in the property appraiser's office dealing with the identification of the bona fideness of religious activity, religious purpose of a piece of property. And if it was a true religious purpose for that piece of property, they could earn an exempt tax status in that regard. So we spent a lot of time doing a lot of research on that subject. Fast forward to my current position as Orange County Mayor, which is the Chief Executive Officer of a jurisdiction now with over 1 million people and a budget approaching $3 billion. So we, in a sense, have to, from an executive viewpoint, deal with these issues on a routine basis. Questions, for example, like, do we pray before a county commission meeting? And the decision that we have made, similar to Congress, which offers prayers before their deliberation, is that we, as a community, as we grow as a community, we grow continually more diverse. And we ask each member of the county commissioner, there are 6 district commissioners in addition to myself, to, on a rotation basis, bring a person of the week to offer an invocation. And we encourage the commissioners to offer up diversity. And I can tell you that we have had almost every kind of religion that I at least know of represented in that regard, and we do that before we open our meetings with the pledge to the flag as one nation under God. So that's how we deal with that issue. There's a bit of a joke in the mayor's office, which has to do with the mayor and his 3 friends, the rabbi, the imam, and the priest, because I try to bring people together, and I think that those on the later panel would agree that as a county government, we celebrate diversity, not just in culture and education and things of that nature, but in terms of religion as well. One of the big issues today that we face from a government perspective, again at the local level, are so-called faith-based initiatives. The President made this a major plank in his election campaign, later implemented it through executive order, and certainly faith-based initiatives have been discussed in more recent times. And I can tell you, applying my experience as property appraiser, what we have to look at specifically is religious purpose as we enter into those kind of agreements. And we do have a wide range of commitment in Orange County government to children and families. We have a commission for children. We have after-school zone plans. We administer Head Start. There are programs that really focus on children and families. We also, in the area of emergency management, call on the faith community, along with the nonprofit community and the for-profit community and the volunteer community, to work together for emergency preparedness and response as well. So we have a routine relationship as it relates to our faith-based community here. We actually have contracts, particularly in areas where there is a high need for the delivery of social services, and administer some of those programs through churches. But again, we have to vet those programs out. We have to make sure that we're talking about social services and not religious services. And one of the ways that we do that is in our actual contracts with churches that may get county monies, even if it's pass-through monies from the state or federal government, is that there's a specific clause in those contracts that prohibits proselytizing those who would enter those clinics or those counseling services or the HIV services that are offered there in terms of presenting a religious viewpoint. And we put those right in our contracts, that's a great conversation to have, but just not there. So that's a brief overview of some of my personal involvement in the issue. Again, I'm not a constitutional expert on the matter, but I do have some experiential education that I hope will be helpful and be able to stimulate some good questions as we proceed. Thanks. Good to be with you all today.
I want you to imagine a situation. We're about a month away from Halloween, and you come back to Washington with me, and we've got you some passes to go watch an oral argument before the United States Supreme Court. The issue before them is that a local public school, which allows teachers and students to dress up on Halloween, has had that challenged, saying that that's unconstitutional under the First Amendment. The reason being, some of the teachers and students dressed up as witches. Those are significant religious symbols, he argues, according to the Wicca religion, which practices witchcraft and makes that Halloween their New Year's Day. And they would like to declare that allegedly religious practice unconstitutional. As you sit there in the audience, the first question to the attorney from the school board comes from Justice Thomas, and he says, I understand that some of the teachers dressed up as witches. Did anybody dress up as Britney Spears and Kevin Federline? The next question comes from Justice Scalia. Did anybody dress up as Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie? The Chief Justice weighs in with his superior Harvard intellect and asks, did anybody dress up as Napoleon Dynamite? And finally, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wants to know if anybody wore a George W. Bush mask. Surprising questions? Every one of those questions is relevant. In fact, how that court will rule turns on the answer to those questions. You see, if in addition to dressing up as the witches, there were other secular symbols from popular culture, such as Angelina Jolie or Napoleon Dynamite or George W. Bush, the actions of that public school are lawful and constitutional under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The blurring of church and state turns on such little facts, just like that. Today, I'm going to talk about two issues, share with you my experience with respect to the celebration of religious holidays in the public schools, but then more importantly, give you the inside scoop or what the hot issues are we're facing right now, this week, in the United States Congress, dealing with church and state issues. And I can tell you ahead of time they're going to be, should we fund faith-based Head Start programs for the students who were displaced as a result of Hurricane Katrina? Should we give them vouchers that they can use at private religious schools? Should the Pledge of Allegiance be allowed to stand with the words "under God" in it? And should we approve Justice Roberts this week in the United States Senate to be the new Chief Justice? Well, let me begin by talking about the celebration of religious holidays in the public schools. I graduated from Vanderbilt Law School in 1992 and had the happy privilege of being trained in constitutional law there, although I never thought I would need it as a practicing lawyer. I thought I'd be handling cases about who ran the red light and was someone discriminated against at work and the product liability cases. But here I had been practicing law only 1 year, and a senior partner comes into my office and he said, "How would you like to save Halloween for the public schools in the United States?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And there was a lawsuit that had been brought by the Alachua County School Board, which is a school board governing the Gainesville area, by someone named Mr. Geyer, who had challenged the legality of the Alachua County public schools allowing their teachers and students to dress up as witches and other symbols on Halloween. And he claimed that those were significant religious symbols under the Wiccan religion, and filed the lawsuit. And it was our job as the firm representing the Alachua County School Board to handle that case. And as a young associate, that had been flopped on my desk. And that case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And so I got to learn a little bit firsthand about these experiences. In this particular case, teachers admittedly did dress up as witches, and there were broomsticks and cauldrons and everything else. But we had other students who dressed up as clowns, and Ronald Reagan masks were worn, and similar popular culture famous people. We won at the trial court level. We went up to the appellate court, then the Florida Supreme Court, then all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the test that was applied is under the Supreme Court called Lemon versus Kurtzman. And to determine whether an action violates the establishment clause, they asked three things. Number one, is there a secular purpose? And our secular purpose means it's a fun day for kids to dress up and get as much candy as they can and share in this community experience. Second test, is there a primary or principal effect to advance or inhibit religion? That's where it's important to have these secular symbols. You see, we weren't there to promote the Wiccan religion. Nobody even talked about that. That's why we had kids dressing up in all kind of costumes. That's why it's relevant whether someone dressed as Angelina Jolie or Napoleon Dynamite. The third issue, is there excessive entanglement with religion by the government? Did anyone specifically promote a particular type of religion? Were there pamphlets handed out saying, don't be a Methodist or a Baptist, be a Wiccan? And that certainly didn't take place. And so that decision was allowed to stand by the United States Supreme Court, which denied certiorari jurisdiction. When I was in law school, I remember our professor talking about the celebration of religious holidays in the public schools. Almost every holiday has some religious and secular significance to it, whether it's Halloween, Christmas, Easter. And I remember him telling us that, you think of these very austere 9 people, the best legal minds in the world on the U.S. Supreme Court in their black robes, and they have to handle these challenging constitutional issues. But when someone challenges a nativity scene in a government area, whether it be a public school or the city square, the question is, we know that there was the wise men in the manger there. Was there also a reindeer or a snowman? And some of the biggest questions come down to those fact patterns. And I thought it kind of funny at the time, but in real life, I've lived it and taken that case to the Supreme Court. That's really the way it's interpreted with respect to celebration of religious holidays in the public schools. Now I want to give you the inside look at what the hot issues are, as promised, that we're dealing with in Congress. And the first one is something that we debated on the House floor this past Thursday, and that is the Head Start program. Should Catholic churches and other religious institutions who receive federal dollars under the Head Start program to provide preschool services be able to hire teachers and child care workers based on their religion? In other words, can the Catholic Church hire someone who's Catholic, or are they required to hire someone from another religion if they're equally qualified? Must they hire someone who practices witchcraft, for example? And that was a hotly debated issue, and it was resolved by the U.S. House of Representatives on this Thursday, September 22nd, by a vote in favor of this Head Start bill, which allowed Catholic churches the freedom to hire people who are in their own religion if they want. And if they decide to hire somewhere else, they can, but they're not required to. It passed narrowly, a vote of 231 to 84. Almost all Republicans support it. 23 Democrats supported it as well. The supporter says that Catholic churches shouldn't be required to hire someone who practices witchcraft. The opponents say this is a civil rights objection and we shouldn't have a state-sponsored discrimination. So that's an issue that now moves to the Senate. And As with most things, when there's a conflict between the House and Senate, usually at some point we try to reach some sort of compromise that, on the one hand, has good common sense, on the other hand, doesn't run afoul of the Constitution. The second hot issue is Katrina-related private school vouchers. Just last week, the U.S. Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, announced that the federal government would help the 372,000 kids who are displaced by Hurricane Katrina. Many of these kids you may have seen are in Texas now. Of the 372,000, 60,000 were in the private schools in and around the New Orleans area, mostly Catholic schools. She proposed that Congress pay $2.6 billion to help pay for their education in other school districts. That would mean about $7,500 per child. Not a huge controversy about the need to make sure these kids can continue their education. After all, we don't believe that a natural catastrophe should mean that these kids should have an educational catastrophe. The issue is, what about these 60,000 kids who are in private schools? Can we use some of the money if their parents choose to let them continue in a private school of their choice? Let them go to a Catholic school in Houston, Texas. And the Secretary of Education proposed that yes, she's going to set aside, or recommend Congress sets aside, $488 million to be used for private schools. Now, supporters of this say that it's compassionate, that we should give kids quick relief. When they get off the bus from New Orleans to Houston, they should be able to go right on to another school. And as Professor Jewett pointed out, it is constitutional under a recent case coming out of Ohio. Opponents say that this is a backdoor attempt to launch a private school voucher program for the first time nationwide, and very much oppose it. And so that's a debate that will be worked out in the coming weeks on the floor of Congress. The final issue is the Pledge of Allegiance phrase, which has included the words "under God" since 1954. And the issue is saying the Pledge of Allegiance, which includes the words "under God," allowed in the public schools under the First Amendment to our Constitution, so long as children are free not to participate. And the Seventh Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals out of Illinois, says yes, that is constitutional. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out of California says no, it's not constitutional. That issue went up to the U.S. Supreme Court last year, and in June of 2004, the Supreme Court kind of punted the issue. They threw out the lawsuit, but said they did so because the father didn't have legal custody of the child. He didn't have standing to bring the suit, and therefore they lose. Well, the father happens to be an atheist and a doctor and a lawyer, decided that he would go represent some parents and be a real lawyer and represent parents who are also atheists who challenge this. And he filed a brand new lawsuit this year in the California area. And on September 14th, just a few days ago, the Federal District Court again ruled that the Pledge of Allegiance is unconstitutional, saying that didn't necessarily want to have to, but it was bound by the Ninth Circuit precedent since it was in California. And so now that sets up a new split in the circuits in the United States. And so we will likely have a good chance that the Supreme Court will take up this issue once again. I can tell you what Congress thinks. I voted, along with many others, to condemn the decisions of the California courts. This bill we passed the House by a vote of 416 to 3. The Senate also condemned this decision by a vote of 99 to 0. And I'll tell you why. Just because you may have the words "under God" in there doesn't mean you have an establishment of religion. We have a prayer before Congress every day, and doesn't establish religion according to the U.S. Supreme Court. We have a big sign right above the Speaker's mantle there, "In God We Trust," on your bills. "In God We Trust." You know, if we had a public school student stand up and read the Gettysburg Address, which is one of the shortest speeches ever, famous address by Abraham Lincoln, you'd find that President Lincoln mentions God 14 different times. That certainly doesn't violate the Establishment Clause, but that's just our opinion, members of Congress. All we can do is tell the President what we think and say that we want the Attorney General to file appeal to make sure that this decision doesn't stand. The real crux of how this will be decided is determined by the U.S. Supreme Court. And some people may not like the fact that they have to decide such controversial issues, but in the legal world, in terms of interpreting the Constitution, the buck has to stop somewhere, and that's the U.S. Supreme Court. So you have seen a lot of action in the past week in Congress with respect to the nomination of Justice John Roberts. And this past Thursday, the Senate Judiciary Committee approved Justice Roberts by a vote of 13-5. All Republicans and 3 Democrats voting yes. He will go before a full vote of the U.S. Senate this week. And that will determine who our next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is. Justice Roberts wouldn't answer questions about celebration of religious holidays or other controversial issues, and that's appropriate. No justice does, because he doesn't want to prejudge the outcome of a decision. For example, if you were to ask him the question, is it okay to celebrate Halloween in the public schools, he wouldn't answer you, because under the facts that I gave you, it's appropriate to celebrate Halloween in the public schools. I could give you facts where it's not, where the school board says every person must dress up as a witch, every student must dress up as a witch, and we will pass out these pamphlets encouraging people to leave their own religion and join Wicca. That's a violation of the Constitution right there. And so a judge doesn't have all the facts before him when he goes before the U.S. Senate, and so he appropriately objected to those questions, but we don't know how he's going to rule on that or any other issue. And then, of course, we have a new opening to fill the Sandra Day O'Connor seat, and that, too, will be a controversial issue, the issues of church and state. Well, since we are talking about religion here, let me just close my remarks by sharing with you a little story. There was a very talented country preacher who gave a speech just outside of Nashville when I was in law school, and I asked him his advice on public speaking. And he told me this little story. He had always wanted to speak to this tiny little church outside of Johnson City, Tennessee. And he was so excited, they finally invited him to speak to this church. And so he practiced his sermon all week. And the big day came, and he walked up to the pulpit, and he looked out at the congregation, and only one member of the congregation had shown up. It was a country farmer sitting in the back row. And the preacher didn't know what to do. So he walks back and says, "Listen, I've been preparing all week to give this sermon, but you're the only one here. You want to just go home, or you want me to go ahead and give the sermon? Either way." And the country farmer said, "Listen, I'm just a country farmer. I don't pretend on giving a learned man like you any advice. But if I was to load up my truck full of hay and take it out the pasture to feed my horses, and only one horse showed up, I reckon I'd still feed it." And that sounded like good common sense. And he walked back up to the pulpit, and for 45 minutes gave the most passionate, enthusiastic, electric sermon of his life. He knew it was good. He raced back to the farm and said, "Well, what'd you think? What'd you think? Did you like it? Did you like it?" Again, I'm just a country farmer. I don't pretend on giving a learned man like you any advice. But if I was to load up my truck full of hay and take out the pasture to feed my horses, and only one horse showed up, I don't reckon I'd feed him the whole darn thing. So I won't feed you the whole thing. Thank you for coming out today.
I was wondering to the Congressman, since the Under God statement was added in by President Eisenhower due to the Cold War, now that the Cold War is over, has there been any consideration in Congress to remove those statements?
The short answer is no. Congress is vehemently opposed to the decisions coming out of the Ninth Circuit. In fact, they are so offended that the Judiciary Committee on which I serve has proposed to split up the Ninth Circuit like a piñata and other things. It's considered by us in Congress to be by far the single worst circuit in the United States. Their cases are overturned on appeal more than any other circuit. And so you see a pretty bipartisan disapproval of any judicial opinions condemning the phrase "under God" as used in the Pledge of Allegiance. So that's the Congress's side. But let me say this. It's up to the Supreme Court to decide. And there are opinions that I don't like coming out of the Supreme Court, but I believe strongly in an independent judiciary. And whatever they decide, they decide.
Do you find it possible to be against something from a religious standpoint, but support public policy that would go against that belief?
My opinion, someone said, you can't legislate morality, and I don't know if I buy that 100%, to be honest with you. I mean, murder is immoral, and we legislate that. Rape is immoral, we legislate that. Child molesting is immoral, we legislate that. I do try to vote the way that I think best for the country and my constituents. I have my own religious views, but I don't try to impose them on other people. I'm sensitive to the fact that with my own background, that people view things differently. My mom is a Christian and a Democrat and a Tennessean, and my dad is Jewish and a Republican and a New Yorker. I don't know why they got divorced. I'm sensitive to the fact that there are people from all walks of life who are good people who happen to honestly view things differently. So I can't say that my decisions are totally unrelated to my faith, but I try to vote what's best for my constituents and not necessarily try to put what I believe over on other folks.
Let me respond as well. I am very active and strong in my personal faith. But I recall a recent sermon that my pastor gave, and he talked about not being afraid to go and socialize with those of other faiths and those who would have different viewpoints from a religious perspective, that we all might take something away from each other and share those ideas. And as he was giving that sermon, I was taken aback by how much he seemed to be relating to how we, as I described earlier, operate Orange County government, that we try to invite various viewpoints into the process and listen to people with different opinions. And the two things that are difficult to talk about are the two things we're talking about today, which is religion and politics, because I think it's undeniable that what you believe as an individual is crafted by how you were raised, what faith you were raised in, what even political party you were raised in. So I think we all have to try to balance that and try to come to a good decision. But one of the ways that everybody makes decisions, and that's one of the reasons that you get elected, frankly, is because oftentimes your views mirror up well with your constituency. People like you oftentimes are the people who elect you. So I think you have to be sensitive to that and acknowledge that a lot of times the things that you believe are reflected in how you vote. At the same time, I think you need to be sensitive to the facts and try to balance those things.
Congressman Keller, as an attorney, you being an attorney, I was wondering what your views on original intent are, especially considering in regards to religion and considering Madison's detached memoranda and memorial and remonstrance. I know I'm aware of also Jefferson attending church services in what was the Congress, but I was wondering what your opinions were on original intent.
First of all, with respect to the issue we're there today, I believe that our founders did believe that this is one nation under God. I think that's well established. I can tell you that I am very interested with respect to the intent of what the framers were when they wrote certain things. But I'm interested in what the intent of folks were when they passed different amendments to the Constitution as well. And I think they're entitled to great respect. But doesn't mean that sometimes we can't take a look at something. I think African Americans count more than 3/5 of a person, frankly. And I think it's right to revisit that. And so just because that's said somewhere in the Constitution doesn't mean it's right. And so let me just say this. One thing I learned when I draft legislation and I'm trying to deal with intent, I learned something from our Chief Justice Rehnquist on that issue in terms of the intent, and that is I had lunch with Justice Rehnquist about 2 years ago. It wasn't supposed to be a lunch between he and I. It was Justice Rehnquist and members of the Judiciary Committee, and it was supposed to be at noon in the Capitol, and I showed up, and the Chief Justice showed up, and it was just us for about half an hour. And I said to him, what, if anything, could you give advice to me about as a young legislator to make your job as a Supreme Court justice easier? And he said the biggest debate we have is the intent, the initial intent of what some legislative body did when passing legislation. He said, don't make me guess anymore. Just put it right there in the statute. What exactly is your intent in passing this legislation? And so I have done that with most pieces of legislation since then to make it crystal clear so we don't have to have a debate among the justices about what the intent is.
What is the current status of intelligent design in Congress? Have they worked on any bills, any discussion of science class?
No, and for those of you not familiar with the buzzword intelligent design, that's an ongoing debate about evolution versus creationism in the public schools. And the position of Congress has been and will continue to remain that's a local issue, and will be up to each and every local school board to decide for themselves how they want to deal with that issue.